The Texas GOP platform pledges to exert its influence to dispel the myth of the separation of church and state. The next section of this talk is about dismantling the federal government. The goal of dismantling the federal government is not original. Some very extreme conservatives have been trying to do it for years. What's different about Dominionism? Dominionism doesn't plan to dismantle the federal government so that the neediest can fend for themselves. They want to transfer that responsibility to the churches. Remember, the federal government would recede into the background and the churches would assume responsibility for welfare and education. The Texas GOP party platform calls for downsizing the federal government. And how do you do that? We support the abolition of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Office of the Surgeon General, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Departments of Energy, Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, Education, Commerce, and Labor. We also call for the defunding or abolition of the National Endowment for the Arts and the public broadcasting system. A number of these agencies protect American citizens. They protect the environment. They protect worker health. They protect public safety, consumer fraud, and the Department of Energy oversees nuclear weapon facilities. Imagine eliminating oversight of nuclear weapons. But we will stay focused on the two agencies that help those least able to help themselves. Those are the Departments of Housing and Urban Development and Health and Human Services. These two agencies provide critical services for the poor. If these two departments are abolished, who will help those least able to help themselves? According to America's providential history, Scripture makes it clear that God is the provider, not the state. That sentence describes President Bush's faith-based initiative. God is the provider, not the state. Not only is President Bush shifting the responsibility for welfare to religious institutions, he's also shifting responsibility for education by fighting for school vouchers. Vouchers use taxpayer dollars to fund religious schools' tuition. Jerry Falwell wrote around the time that he was forming the moral majority, "I hope to live to see the day when we won't have any public schools. The churches will have taken them over again and Christians will be running them." From the Texas Republican Party platform. We call for the abolition of the U.S. Department of Education and the prohibition of the transfer of any of its functions to any other federal agency. It's pretty strong language. Not only would the department be abolished, but its functions can't be transferred to any other agency. Now we're going to talk about the tool for dismantling the federal government, tax cuts. As everyone knows, tax cuts are one of Bush's signature issues. Some economists believe that tax cuts have stimulated the economy, and maybe that's what they're really about, but it's curious that these tax cuts, which benefit the top 1% of the country, are so important at a time when the United States is fighting not only one, but two expensive wars, and experiencing record deficits. And it's especially curious that the president has been trying to make them permanent. Let's look at what America's providential history says about tax cuts. It claims that most taxes are unbiblical. Income tax is idolatry, property tax is theft, and inheritance taxes are simply not allowed in the Bible. The Texas Republican Party doesn't want to just cut taxes. It urges the IRS be abolished. Dennis Hastert, Republican of Illinois, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, he just published an autobiography in which he too advocates abolishing the IRS. America's providential history claims that the most biblical tax, the most acceptable tax from the biblical worldview, is where everyone pays the same percentage of their income in taxes, called a flat tax. And that places the greatest burden on the poor. Dennis Hastert is also calling for a flat tax. The Texas GOP platform calls for eliminating the income tax, inheritance tax, gift tax, capital gain tax, corporate income tax, payroll tax, and property tax. Notice what's missing: a sales tax. And America's providential history doesn't single out sales tax as unbiblical. Do you think it's coincidence that the Speaker of the House is calling for national sales tax? Such a tax again places the greatest burden on the poor. It also burdens our cities and counties, which rely heavily on that tax. Not only is the Speaker of the House calling for a national sales tax, at a campaign stop in Florida, President Bush said, abolishing the U.S. income tax system and replacing it with a national sales tax was an idea worth considering. Next, we're going to talk about biblical law, which is at the heart of Dominion theology. Justice James Leon Holmes was appointed to a federal court in Arkansas on July 6, 2004. He wrote, "Christianity transcends the political order and cannot be subordinated to the political order." There you have a definition of biblical law. The Bible has supremacy over the Constitution. This view of the law has an interesting take on women, often quoted as a passage from Ephesians of the New Testament. "Wives, submit to your own husband as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church." According to biblical law, then, the woman should be subordinate to the man. Just as Holmes wrote, the woman is to place herself under the authority of the man. Dominionists view homosexuality as a criminal activity. From the Texas GOP platform, "We oppose the legalization of sodomy." The key words here are oppose and legalization. This movement does not want to just ban gay marriage. They want to make gay relationships illegal. In other words, homosexuality should be a crime. Senator Rick Santorum told an Associated Press reporter his views on homosexuality and the law. Senator Santorum is a rising star in his party. He's only in his second term, but he's risen to the number 3 spot in the Republican Party. That's a meteoric rise. And this doesn't just happen. His peers have put him there. Senator Santorum, talking about the Texas anti-sodomy laws, which the Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional in June of 2003, said, "If the Supreme Court says you have the right to consensual sex in your own home, then you have the right to bigamy, you have the right to polygamy, you have the right to incest, you have the right to adultery." Well, if homosexuals and adulterers don't have the right to consensual sex in their own homes, then they're criminals. And criminals go to prison. In this interview, Santorum sounds like a Christian Reconstructionist, wanting to criminalize both homosexuality and adultery. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution about adultery, and yet President Clinton was impeached. He was charged for lying under oath, but the impeachment proceedings began 7 months before he ever testified. President Clinton's impeachment was not about lying under oath. It was about enforcing biblical law. Most disturbing about Clinton's impeachment was that only 5 Republicans in the House voted against it. There are many more than 5 moderate Republicans in the House. This vote demonstrates the ability of Dominionists to coerce legislators to support their bills whether or not they agree with it. The president didn't violate the Constitution. He sinned against one of the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments are the foundation of biblical law. And there's a crusade taking place in this country to place the 10 Commandments in public buildings.